The elevator chimed at 11:58 p.m., and Cole Hargrove's heart stopped. He was 43 floors above Michigan Avenue, pushing his cleaning cart past the executive conference rooms where the leather chairs
Is
cost
she
more
still
than his
asleep?
truck.
Yes.
The
What are
night
you doing
shift
here?
had its own
I
rhythm,
had to see you.
the
We
hum
need to
of
talk.
HVAC
Okay.
systems, the soft scrape of cartwheels on polished concrete, the distant murmur of Chicago alive below even at midnight. Cole had learned that rhythm over 4 years. He knew which motion sensors flickered before stabilizing, which bathroom faucets dripped, which hallway lights buzzed at a frequency that set your teeth on edge after 3 hours. He knew this floor the way a man knows his own neighborhood, not because he loved it, but because survival required that kind of attention. What he hadn't learned was how to be invisible when he wasn't alone. The chime wasn't unusual by itself. The number was. Floor 44 required a keycard that only 3 people possessed after 10 p.m., and Cole had already passed the other 2 maintenance supervisor, Glenn, who'd clocked out at 9, and the overnight security chief, who was currently 3 floors down, managing a water leak in the server room. That left one person who could be stepping off that elevator right now, and Cole's hands tightened on the cart handle as he turned toward the conference room, his shoes betraying him with a squeak sharp enough to cut glass. He was too slow. He'd always been too slow for the world that people like her moved through. Nora Caldwell stepped out of the elevator, and the corridor seemed to rearrange itself around her. She wore a dark suit at nearly midnight, not rumpled, not loosened at the collar, but precise and deliberate, as though she'd dressed for this moment specifically. Her dark hair was pulled back with the kind of severity that communicated nothing accidental had ever happened in her presence. Forbes had run her photo last month above the headline, "The Iron Ceiling." And standing there in the corridor light, Cole understood why the editors had chosen that phrase. There was something architectural about her stillness, something load-bearing. Her eyes found him first. Then they moved to the conference room door, which Cole had left 6 inches open, and through that gap the city lights painted a soft gold band across the sofa where Lily slept. The air in the corridor changed. "You brought a child into my building." Her voice carried no heat, which made it worse. Anger Cole could navigate. This was something else, controlled, precise, the verbal equivalent of a scalpel. Cole's throat tightened. He was aware, with the particular awareness of a man who'd been calculating risk his entire adult life, exactly what was balanced on the next 30 seconds. The job was $19 an hour night shift, health insurance that actually covered Lily's asthma medication without a fight. He'd worked 3 different positions before this one: a warehouse in Bridgeport, a hospital in Oak Park, a parking garage in the Loop, and none of them had offered benefits worth mentioning. Caldwell Systems had. He'd been grateful for that in the way a drowning man is grateful for a rope, not questioning what it was tied to. 2 weeks ago, a letter had arrived from Alicia's attorney. He still knew it word for word, the language burned into memory the way things burn when they carry a threat to something you can't afford to lose. Father's employment schedule and current living situation preclude adequate supervision and a stable home environment for the minor child. Alicia's lawyer was building a case. One more strike, one documented incident, one termination for cause, and a family court judge might listen. Cole opened his mouth and said the only thing that was true. "Miss Caldwell, my name is Cole Hargrove. I'm one of the night custodians. I've worked this shift for 4 years, and I swear to you this has never happened before tonight. The person who watches my daughter canceled 2 hours before my shift, and I couldn't find anyone, and I ran out of options." He paused because the next part was harder to say out loud. "She's 6. She has asthma. I couldn't leave her alone." Nora Caldwell said nothing for a moment. She was looking at the conference room door, at the band of gold light, at whatever piece of Lily was visible through that gap. Her hands were at her sides, and Cole noticed, because he noticed things, it was part of how he'd survived, that they were not entirely still. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and something moved across her face too quickly for Cole to name. She pressed the side button, and the screen went dark. But her hands, when she pocketed the phone again, were still not entirely still. That detail small, Almost nothing was the thing that kept Cole standing instead of already moving toward the elevator with Lily over one shoulder and whatever remained of his dignity over the other. "What's her name?" Nora said. "Lily." "How long has she been asleep?" "About an hour. She goes out fast when she's tired." Cole watched Nora's face. "I set up a cushion from the supply closet. I checked. Nothing in that room she can hurt herself on. I'm aware of what's in my own conference rooms." But there was no bite in it. Nora turned from the door and looked at Cole directly, and whatever calculation she was running behind her eyes, it was moving fast. "Come with me." She walked into the conference room and Cole followed, because what else did a man do when the person who controlled his livelihood walked somewhere? Inside, Lily was exactly as he'd left her, curled on the sofa with his work jacket tucked around her, her small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of deep sleep, one hand loosely holding the stuffed rabbit that had been in her grip since she was 3 years old. The rabbit was missing an eye and had been repaired twice with mismatched thread, and it was the most important object in Cole's world because it was the most important object in Lily's. Nora stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawling behind her 43 stories down, and she turned to look at Cole with an expression that had changed. The ice was still there, but something beneath it had shifted like a fault line making itself known. "How much do you love your daughter?" Cole stared at her. "I'm sorry." "It's not a complicated question. How much? Would you do something that looked wrong from the outside if it kept her safe? Would you let people believe something that wasn't entirely true if it meant she stayed with you?" The question landed somewhere between his ribs and didn't move. Cole looked at Lily at her hand loose around the rabbit at the way her breath fogged faintly in the air-conditioned cold. "Of course I would. She's everything." Nora nodded once the way someone nods when they've confirmed a calculation. "Then I need you to listen carefully because I'm going to make you an offer, and once I've made it, there's no taking it back and no pretending you didn't hear it. If you say no, you leave tonight, and security processes your termination by morning. Your record will show cause. If you say yes, both our lives change, and there are conditions, and you need to understand them before you agree." Her phone buzzed again in her pocket. She didn't reach for it this time, but Cole saw her jaw tighten. "I need you to play the role of my husband." The words hit him like a step he didn't know was there. He grabbed the back of the nearest chair. "Starting tomorrow," she continued, her voice carrying the flat precision of someone reading contract terms, "in front of the people who make decisions that affect my life board members, investors, my legal team, anyone who matters in the next 6 weeks, you will present as my husband. We will have a history. We will have a story. We will behave in all public contexts as though we are genuinely married." She paused. "Because legally, we will be." "I don't understand." "My former business partner filed a lawsuit 3 days ago, seeking to have me removed as CEO of the company I built. The board votes in 72 hours. She reached into her jacket pocket and produced her phone again, pulling up a document. "Grant Mercer is arguing that I am mentally unstable and unfit for leadership. His specific claim is that I have no life outside this office, that my relationship to power has become pathological, that I lack the personal stability required of someone in my position." She swiped to another screen. "His evidence includes 17-hour workdays, no significant personal relationships, no family involvement, no demonstrated capacity for anything beyond professional function." "And he's not wrong," Cole said, because it was the obvious thing, and sometimes obvious things needed saying. Nora looked at him. For a moment something moved through her expression that wasn't calculation, something rawer and harder to categorize. "He's not entirely wrong," she said, "which is why his lawsuit is dangerous. I can't fight it by arguing that my personal life is adequate. I have to demonstrate that I have one." She gestured between them. "You are a single father working night shifts to provide for your daughter. You are devoted. You are the kind of person that people like my board members find credible when they talk about balance and family and grounding. And you have a daughter who needs you to have stable employment and a stable income, which means you have exactly as much to lose as I do if this falls apart." Cole was quiet for a long time. Through the windows, Chicago glittered without comment. "You want me to lie to your board of directors. I want you to play a role for 6 weeks. You'll appear at board meetings, at 2 investor dinners, at whatever public-facing events arise as my husband. My attorney will brief you on the backstory. We'll cover the timeline, how we met, how the marriage happened. It will be legally real, the paperwork will be filed, the license will be registered. Everything above board in the eyes of the law. The deception is in the context, not the document. This is insane. This is survival." The mask slipped just for a moment, just enough for Cole to see what was underneath it, which was fear in its most distilled form. Grant spent 3 years building toward this. He's been managing journalists, cultivating relationships with board members who were already skeptical of me building a narrative that I am not capable of sustained human connection. This lawsuit is not the beginning. It's the part of the chess game where he takes his hand off the piece. "Why does he hate you this much?" "Because I chose the company over him." She said it without apology, without softening. "We built Caldwell Systems together. We were partners before we were anything else. When the company hit serious revenue for the first time, something changed in him the way money sometimes changes people who spent a long time without it. I found evidence he'd been running shell corporations to extract funds from our shared accounts, $8 million over 18 months. Her jaw set. I gave him a choice. Take a generous settlement, sign away his interest in the company and leave quietly, or I would go to federal prosecutors with what I had. He took the settlement. He's never forgiven me for being the one who found it." She pulled up another document, a contract, the text small and dense. $50,000 deposited within 24 hours. Another $150,000 when the arrangement concludes at the 6-week mark. Full tuition at Rosewood Academy for Lily, prepaid for the academic year. Your position is reclassified to Director of Facilities Management, effective immediately at a salary of $92,000 per year. Cole did the arithmetic. It took about 3 seconds. "Or," Nora said, her voice dropping half a register, "I call building security right now, and by tomorrow morning your employment record shows termination for cause, and Alicia's attorney gets to spend the next 6 months explaining to a family court judge why your stable job suddenly disappeared." She looked at Lily, then back at Cole. "Her sneakers are too small. I can tell from here." Cole's chest went tight with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite shame, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. He looked at his daughter, at the jacket keeping her warm that was supposed to be his jacket, at the worn canvas of her shoes poking out beneath the makeshift blanket. He thought about the letter from Alicia's lawyer. He thought about the phrase "stable home environment" and what it would sound like read aloud in a courtroom. "If I do this," he said, "what exactly does it require? My attorney will walk you through the specifics tomorrow. You'll memorize a timeline, how we met, the progression of the relationship, the circumstances of the marriage. You'll move into my apartment on Lakeshore Drive with Lily. You'll attend events. You'll need to be convincing in the way that only comes from commitment to the role, not from rehearsal." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking you to feel something. I'm asking you to behave as though you do. And at the end of 6 weeks, you walk away with the financial terms fulfilled, your daughter enrolled in the best private school in Chicago, and a salary that puts you in a position to fight any custody challenge your ex-wife's attorney dreams up. Why me?" The question came out before he'd entirely decided to ask it. "You have 1,800 employees. Why the janitor you caught breaking company policy?" Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to respect. "Because you have a daughter. Because you have something real to protect. And because the kind of desperation that makes a man bring his sick child to work at midnight rather than risk losing her is exactly the kind of motivation that makes someone reliable." She straightened. "We both have everything to lose if this fails. That's a better guarantee than money." Lily stirred on the sofa, murmuring something half-formed, her small hand tightening around the rabbit. Cole watched her settle back into sleep. He thought about the two-bedroom apartment he'd been calling temporary for 2 years. He thought about the neighbors who fought through the walls until 3 a.m. about the heat that worked inconsistently about the morning 3 weeks ago when Lily had asked him why their home felt like they were just visiting. Okay. The word came out before the rest of him had finished deciding. I'll do it. Nora's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. It was the most visible sign of relief Cole would see from her for a long time. My driver will collect you tomorrow at noon. Bring everything. We start immediately. She moved toward the door, then stopped without turning around. And Cole, if you tell anyone the truth about this arrangement, the contract terminates, and my attorneys begin litigation for breach within 48 hours. Do you understand? I understand. After she left, Cole stood in the conference room for a long time, the city shimmering 43 floors below the weight of what he'd agreed to settling over him, the way cold air settles, gradually finding every gap. Lily woke around 1 a.m. and rubbed her eyes and found him standing by the window. Daddy, I had a dream about a castle. Cole crossed to the sofa and gathered her up, feeling her arms lock around his neck with the absolute trust of a child who has never had reason to doubt the arms holding her. Yeah. Were we in it? You and me and a pretty lady. She lived there. Lily pressed her face against his shoulder. Was that a real place? His chest ached in a way that had no clean name. Not yet, sweetheart, but maybe soon. Is the lady nice? Cole thought about the fear under Nora Caldwell's control. He thought about her hands, which had not been entirely still. I don't know yet, he said, but I think she's trying to be. In the morning, Cole packed their lives into 3 suitcases and 2 cardboard boxes salvaged from the recycling area behind their building, and it took less than an hour. That was the fact that sat in his chest while he worked, not the prospect of where they were going, but the fact that everything he and Lily owned fit so neatly, so quickly into containers that had held someone else's things first. 2 years of temporary had taught him not to accumulate. He wasn't sure whether that was practical or sad. Probably both. Lily sat cross-legged on the bed, watching him, her rabbit in her lap, her expression carrying the particular gravity of a 6-year-old who knows something significant is happening and is deciding how to feel about it. Are we going somewhere far? Across the city? Same city? For how long? Cole set down the box he was packing and knelt in front of her, which was how he'd learned to have hard conversations at her level, eye contact, no shortcuts. For a while. A few weeks, maybe more. We're going to stay with someone, a woman named Nora. She has a nice place and you'll have your own room, and it's important that you're on your best behavior. Okay? We're going to be playing a game, kind of. Pretending. Lily's eyes narrowed. She was sharper than he sometimes remembered. Pretending what? That Nora and I are very good friends, like grown-up friends. Like how Mama Alicia has Richard. Cole paused. Something like that. But it's just a game, just for a little while. It's important for my work. Can you do that for me? Lily hugged her rabbit and looked at him with the eyes of a child who understood more than she should have to. I don't like lying. I know you don't. I don't either. He held her gaze. But sometimes grown-ups have to do hard things to protect the people they love. Do you trust me? Always, she said without hesitation, which was the thing that made it hardest. At noon, exactly, a black Cadillac Escalade pulled to the curb outside their building. The driver was a man with silver hair and unhurried eyes who introduced himself as Walter and loaded their suitcases without comment, without the flicker of expression that might have said, "This is all you have." Cole would remember that courtesy for a long time. Lily pressed her face against the window, the whole drive watching the city resolve from their neighborhood into downtown and then north along the lake. Her commentary, a running thread of observations, that building's taller than the other one. The water looks green today. Why are there so many flags on that bridge? Cole answered everything and stored the image away the way he stored things that he wanted to be able to find. Later his daughter's face in the afternoon light discovering Chicago like it was the first time. The building on Lakeshore Drive announced itself with the quiet confidence of things that don't need to announce themselves. Glass and steel, the lake visible from the entrance, a lobby with a ceiling that made Cole briefly recalibrate his sense of space. The elevator opened directly into the apartment, no hallway, no transition, and Cole stepped out into a foyer larger than the living room he'd just left, with windows that turned the entire north wall into a frame for Lake Michigan stretching to the horizon. He heard Lily's breath catch beside him. Nora was waiting in the living room. She'd changed into dark jeans and a pale blouse that probably cost more than Cole's monthly rent, and standing in her own space she looked different than she had in the corridor, not less formidable but more real, less like a Forbes cover story and more like a woman who was genuinely uncertain about something she'd set in motion. "Welcome," she said, and then looking at Lily, "Hi." Lily retreated behind Cole's leg. He put a hand on her shoulder. Nora did something he didn't expect. She crouched down to Lily's level, an ungainly maneuver in heeled boots that she managed with apparent determination. "I know this is a strange place and you don't know me. New places are scary sometimes, but you're safe here." She paused. "Would you like to see your room?" Lily looked up at Cole. He nodded. She took one step forward, then another, and when Nora straightened and offered her hand, Lily studied it for a moment, the gesture of a child running a careful risk assessment, and then took it. The room at the end of the hall had been prepared by someone who'd asked the right questions. Soft yellow walls, white trim, a canopy bed with stuffed animals, still-tagged bookshelves running floor to ceiling filled with picture books and early chapter books, a window seat looking out at the lake, a desk with art supplies arranged in the orderly way of someone who expected them to become disorderly soon, a toy box, a small rug with a sun pattern, everything a child should have and almost never has all at once. Lily stopped in the doorway. She was quiet for long enough that Cole started to worry. Then she walked in slowly, touching things: the spine of a book, the ear of a stuffed elephant, the smooth wood of the desk, the way you touch things when you're checking whether they're real. She picked up a stuffed bear from the bed, holding it with both hands. "Can I really keep this? Everything in this room is yours," Nora said, "for as long as you're here." Lily set the bear down carefully, then turned and wrapped both arms around Nora's knees in a hug that was entirely impulsive and entirely sincere and clearly knocked Nora sideways. Cole watched Nora's hands hover for a moment, that hesitation again, the motion of someone who knew the theory but had limited practice, before settling gently on Lily's back. "Thank you," Lily said into Nora's leg. "You're welcome," Nora said, and her voice had changed. So, Diane Weston arrived at 2 o'clock with a leather briefcase and an expression that suggested she had no patience for anything that wasn't useful. She was in her mid-50s, gray-streaked hair, severe enough to convey authority eyes that took inventory of Cole in the 3 seconds before she extended her hand. "Cole Hargrove, I'm Nora's attorney. Sit down. We have a significant amount of ground to cover and a limited window to cover it in." For the next 3 hours, Diane walked Cole through the architecture of a relationship that had never existed with the precision of a general briefing, a soldier on terrain he'd never visited but would soon need to navigate blind. 7 months ago, at a benefit gala for STEM education at the Art Institute of Chicago, Cole had been volunteering through Caldwell Systems' community outreach program, handling setup and logistics. Nora had delivered the keynote address on closing the opportunity gap in technology careers. During the cocktail hour following the speech, they'd found themselves in conversation near the back of the room. Cole with a water glass. Nora briefly between the obligations that tended to fill every minute of her public appearances. They'd talked about workforce development, about the gap between the skills people carried and the credentials employers required. Cole had grown up in Cicero, son of a union welder, had started community college on a Pell Grant before his father's diagnosis made the tuition impossible to sustain. He understood the systems Nora was describing from the inside, not the outside. She found that perspective valuable, Diane said, reading from notes with the neutrality of someone reciting weather data. The conversation ran 30 minutes, She sought you out at the end of the evening and asked for your contact information. Cole absorbed this, and then weekly contact for the first month, always discreet given the company's relationship policy regarding executives and employees. A restaurant in Lincoln Park for your first formal date. A small Italian place called Lucia's, the kind of restaurant chosen for quietness rather than prestige. You ordered the carbonara. She had the seafood risotto. You talked about Emma, about Lily, Diane corrected without breaking pace. About Nora's work, about the distance between ambition and the things ambition costs you. The connection was immediate. Diane's delivery remained neutral on this point, as though she narrated imaginary love stories with professional frequency. Subsequent meetings were low-key by design. Coffee, walks along the lakefront, quiet dinners. She wanted the relationship kept private until it was clear it was real. When did we supposedly get married? 3 weeks ago. City Hall, Cook County. No ceremony, no guests. You'd both discussed it and concluded that what you wanted was each other, not an event. Very practical. Very modern. Diane slid a document across the table. Which brings me to the part of this conversation that carries the most legal weight. The marriage license is real, filed and registered with Cook County. You are, as of this morning, legally married to Nora Caldwell. This is not a staged document or a fabrication. It is a genuine legal marriage entered into under circumstances that might not survive scrutiny in a court of law, but which are valid on their face. Cole looked at the document. His name, her name, the seal of Cook County. This seems like a significant escalation from pretending. It is. It's also the only version of this arrangement that survives the scrutiny Grant Mercer will bring to bear on it. A fake marriage can be disproven. A real marriage with an honest paper trail cannot. Diane stacked the documents and produced another thicker folder. The contract. 21 pages. I recommend you read all of them. He did. The financial terms were as Nora had stated. The confidentiality clause was specific, and the penalty for violation was the kind of number that made Cole understand he was operating at a scale that had no relationship to anything in his previous experience. The prenuptial agreement occupied 8 pages and was written in language designed to ensure that at the end of 6 weeks or whatever duration the parties agreed upon, Cole left with exactly what the contract specified and not a molecule more. His hand was steady when he signed, which surprised him. Now, Diane said, collecting everything into her briefcase with efficient precision, let's discuss your first public appearance. Grant has been cultivating skepticism on this board for 3 years. 2 of the 4 members you'll meet tomorrow evening are genuinely uncertain about Nora's fitness to lead. One of them, Helen Drace, is actively hostile, though she frames it as concern. Your job tomorrow night is not to convince them of anything. Your job is to not give them reason to disbelieve. What's the difference? Convincing someone requires them to change a position. Not disbelieving simply requires that nothing you do or say triggers their existing suspicion. The former is persuasion, the latter is behavior. Diane studied him for a moment. You have good instincts. I can tell. Use them. Don't oversell anything. The moment you start trying to seem like something, you stop being it. That evening a stylist arrived at 4 and transformed Cole's wardrobe over the course of 90 minutes. Suits in navy and charcoal shirts that fit the way shirts were apparently supposed to fit when they cost. What these cost: shoes made of leather that had known better lives than any leather he'd previously worn. The stylist, a man named Travis who moved around Cole with a tailor's professional detachment, identified good bone structure, a strong jaw and posture that needed minor adjustment, and by the time he was done, Cole looked in the mirror and recognized a stranger who was by some miracle wearing his face. He found Carmen in the dining room with Lily, who was practicing folding napkins with the seriousness of someone learning a martial art. Carmen, 52 and unhurried, was teaching Lily that details were the places where people formed their first and last impressions, and Lily was absorbing this with the focused intensity she brought to anything that seemed important. "Daddy, I'm learning fancy," she announced. "I can see that." Cole crouched down. Lily was already bathed and dressed in a simple blue dress that had appeared on her bed sometime in the afternoon. Not fussy, not excessive, exactly right. "You look beautiful." "Carmen says I have to remember which side the fork goes on." "Left," Carmen confirmed. "Because details matter," Lily added with the gravity of someone passing along wisdom they intended to keep. Cole found Nora in the kitchen doorway watching. She'd changed into a black dress, simple, and probably the simplest dress in her wardrobe, which still meant it cost more than most things Cole had ever purchased. Her hair was down for the first time, and the effect was significant. She looked less like a byline and more like a person. "The guests arrive at 7, she said. "Sylvia Park is the one we most need. She's been with the company for 8 years, she respects competence, and she's genuinely uncertain rather than adversarial. If she believes us, Owen Pratt will follow. Robert Frank Aldridge runs the meeting. He's fair, but he goes where the evidence leads. And Helen Drace." Nora paused. "Helen will come at you. She'll look for something to pull on. She lost everything in a divorce 2 years ago, and she's decided it gives her authority to identify the same pattern in everyone else." "How do I handle it?" "Don't defend. Don't explain more than you need to. The instinct when someone attacks is to fill the silence with justification. Don't." She looked at him steadily. "You know who you are. You know what brought you here. You don't need her to believe it. You just need to not need her to." It was better advice than he expected, and he carried it into the evening the way you carry something that might be useful. The dinner party assembled with the particular choreography of people who knew each other well enough to be careful. Sylvia Park arrived first with her husband David, a literature professor with the slightly distracted look of someone whose mind was usually elsewhere. He shook Cole's hand with warmth and immediately asked about Lily, which Cole hadn't expected and which told him something about Sylvia's household. Frank Aldridge came next with his wife Linda, whose warmth was genuine and uncomplicated and felt to Cole like oxygen. Owen Pratt arrived with his husband Peter, both of them carrying the relaxed alertness of people who'd learned to read rooms quickly. And last alone, Helen Drace. She was 55 and dressed in the way of someone who had once stopped dressing to please anyone and had recently started again, not entirely comfortably. She shook Cole's hand with the grip of a woman taking a measurement. Her eyes catalogued him not rudely but thoroughly, the way an appraiser catalogues an estate. They gathered in the living room for drinks, and Carmen moved through with appetizers, while Lily, on her absolute best behavior in her blue dress, offered napkins with the concentration of a surgeon. Linda Aldridge accepted one with a warm smile and called Lily darling, and Lily said thank you, which Carmen had apparently drilled alongside the fork placement. Cole positioned himself near Nora the way Diane had coached, close enough to suggest familiarity without the performance of it, a hand resting briefly on her shoulder when she made a point, a shared glance that acknowledged the private dimension of a public conversation. Small things. The architecture of a relationship built in gestures. Sylvia watched. Cole could feel her watching in the way you feel weather coming before it arrives. They moved to the dining room at 7:30, and it was somewhere in the space between the soup course and the main that Helen Drace put down her spoon and looked at Cole with a smile that was structured like a question. "I'm curious about your background, Cole. You were in building management before your recent promotion." The table went quiet in the particular way tables go quiet when the subtext surfaces. Cole set down his own spoon. He did not reach for anything to fill the silence, and he did not look at Nora, because Diane had told him that looking at your spouse for rescue is the tell that undoes everything. He looked at Helen Drace directly, and he said, "I was a custodian, Mrs. Drace. Night shift, 4 years, $19 an hour. I cleaned this building from the basement to the 44th floor." Helen's eyebrows moved. Something recalibrated behind her eyes. "I grew up in Cicero. My father was a union welder for 40 years. Same shop, same union, same commitment to the work, regardless of what the work paid. I started community college on a grant dropped out when he got sick because somebody had to drive him to treatment, and that somebody was me. I've spent most of my adult life doing work that people with degrees walk past without seeing." Cole held her gaze. You're waiting for me to apologize for that. I'm not going to. The table was completely still. Nora asked my name the first time she walked past me at 2 a.m. That was the beginning of the conversation. Cole glanced at Nora, then not for rescue, but to acknowledge something real. People who've spent time being invisible know how to recognize each other. She was carrying things nobody else could see. I was too. We started talking, and the talking didn't stop. Sylvia Park looked at Nora with an expression that was evaluating something entirely different from what Helen had been evaluating. You don't come from her world, Helen said, pressing, and Cole heard in it the echo of every dismissal he'd absorbed in a life spent in the wrong rooms. No, he agreed. I come from a world where a man measures himself by whether his kid has what she needs and whether the people counting on him can count on him. I don't know that those worlds are as different as you're suggesting. He let a beat pass. We got married at City Hall because neither of us has time for a different kind of ceremony and because we both knew what we wanted. I'm 34 with a daughter to raise. Nora's 38 running a company. We stopped waiting for the right moment and made the moment right. He looked around the table. The timing looks convenient because the timing is what it is. What I can tell you is that I'm not here for her money. There's a prenuptial agreement that makes that clear enough, and I'm not here because I was persuaded. I'm here because I walked through a door and found someone I wasn't looking for, and I was smart enough not to walk back out. The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than the one before. Sylvia Park raised her wine glass. To Nora and Cole, she said, may what you've found be worth what you've risked to have it. The clink of glasses was quiet and genuine, and even Helen Drace lifted hers after a moment with something in her expression that might have been reassessment. After the guests left warmly, most of them with the particular goodwill of people who've witnessed something they weren't expecting to find, real Cole carried Lily to her room. She'd fallen asleep on the living room sofa, somewhere between coffee and goodbyes, still holding her rabbit, and she barely woke when he settled her into the canopy bed and tucked the blanket around her. He stood in the doorway for a moment in the soft glow of the nightlight Carmen had apparently thought to provide, watching his daughter breathe. Back in the living room, Nora had taken off her shoes and was sitting on the couch with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been performing for hours and had just been allowed to stop. Cole sat in the chair across from her. Sylvia's ours, Nora said. And where Sylvia goes, Owen follows. Frank runs straight, he'll go where the evidence leads. She looked at the window. Helen's vote was never going to be clean. I know. A silence that wasn't uncomfortable. Cole realized he was tired in a way that had no single source, tired from the performance, from the calculation, from the awareness that he'd agreed to something tonight that went beyond 6 weeks and a paycheck, though he couldn't yet articulate exactly how. His phone buzzed on the end table. Alicia. Heard you moved. New address. He stared at the message. Then he sent her the Lakeshore Drive address because she had the legal right to know where Lily slept, and because there was no clean way around that, even in a situation with no clean edges. Her response was fast, Lakeshore Drive. Seriously, I'm coming to see this. And then a moment later, tomorrow. Cole looked up to find Nora watching him. He showed her the screen. Tomorrow afternoon, he said, before the board meeting prep. Nora considered this for a moment. That's workable. What she sees tomorrow will be exactly what the board needs to hear about. Let her be our first audience. It wasn't the reaction Cole expected, and because it wasn't, it told him something about how Nora Caldwell's mind moved always 2 moves ahead, always converting obstacles into instruments. He filed it alongside the other things he'd learned tonight, the steadiness in the corridor, the hands that weren't entirely still, the way she'd crouched down to Lily's eye level in the hallway, with the awkward sincerity of someone trying very hard at something they hadn't been taught. And then Diane's voice arrived from somewhere, a call, urgent. The news about Grant hiring Whitmore Associates, the fastest, most thorough investigative firm in Chicago, already pulling records, already working backward through Cole's history, his finances, his relationship with Alicia, looking for the thread that unraveled everything. Nora's face went still after the call ended. the kind of still that cost something. She showed Cole the photograph, then Grant's face and hers from years ago younger, caught in whatever version of happiness they'd once managed. Someone had written across it in red before photographing it, "I know everything. Soon everyone else will too." "He has something else," Nora said. "Something he's saving. Grant never comes at you with one weapon. He saves the one that does the most damage for the moment when you think you've already survived." Cole looked at the photograph and then at the woman holding it, and the reality of what he'd agreed to settled through him one more time, not as shock now, but as weight steady, permanent, the kind of thing you learn to carry because the alternative is to put it down. "Then we deal with it when it comes," he said. "Together." Nora looked at him for a moment that lasted slightly longer than necessary, and he couldn't read what was in it, which was unusual for him. Then she put her phone face down on the coffee table and looked out at the lake, which was dark and vast and entirely indifferent to what the people in this room had agreed to. Outside, Chicago glittered and held its breath. Inside, two strangers who were legally married were learning the weight of what they'd walked into, and neither of them had found the bottom of it yet. Monday arrived with Diane Weston and 3 cardboard boxes of documents, and what Cole had thought was preparation revealed itself as something closer to war planning. Diane sat up at the dining table at 8 a.m., her assistants arranging materials in the ordered sequence of a legal team that had done this kind of thing before, or at least something adjacent to it. The apartment had a different quality in daylight, the lake visible through the north windows in shifting bands of gray and blue. Lily already gone to her 3rd day at Rosewood, with Carmen leaving behind the particular silence of rooms that have recently held a child. The strategy as Diane laid it out was built on a single principle: don't hide the unusual circumstances, own them. Grant's case depended on the board finding the marriage suspicious. The counter wasn't to make it look less suspicious, it was to make the board understand that unusual circumstances had produced real change in a person they'd known for years. Let the timeline stand, let the speed of it stand, explain what it had done, not how it had happened. Cole drilled the backstory until it lived in him rather than in memory. The gala, the conversation at the cocktail hour, the first dinner at Lucia's in Lincoln Park. He'd ordered the carbonara. Nora had the seafood risotto. The waiter's name was Marco, and he had an accent from somewhere in the South and a habit of checking on the table every 12 minutes. Cole repeated these details until they arrived without reaching, until they felt less like information and more like weather, something he'd simply been through. Nora sat across the table, running parallel preparation, Diane firing questions at her while one of the assistants timed the responses. The choreography of it, 2 people rehearsing a shared past that hadn't happened, had a strange intimacy, like learning the words to a song you hadn't been present to write. On the balcony during the mid-morning break, Cole leaned against the railing and looked out at the lake and said what he'd been holding since the previous night. "What's the worst thing Grant could reveal?" Nora stood beside him, her coffee held in both hands, and said nothing for long enough that the silence acquired its own texture. Not the silence of someone who didn't have an answer. The silence of someone deciding whether the answer was safe to give. She didn't give it. Not then. What she said instead was, "Grant always has something in reserve. It's how he negotiates. He puts the primary pressure on, waits for you to respond to it, and while you're responding, the secondary comes from a direction you didn't protect." She looked at the water. "Whatever he brings tomorrow, it won't be everything he has." Cole let that sit. He understood the evasion, could feel the shape of what she wasn't saying, and he made the decision not to push the same way he made most of his careful decisions, by recognizing that the alternative would close a door he might need open later. Lily's 3rd day at Rosewood produced a report from Carmen at pickup. She'd attached herself to a girl named Sophie, who shared her appetite for longer books than most first graders attempted, and she'd reportedly astonished her homeroom teacher by reading aloud a passage 3 grade levels above her placement without apparent effort. Cole received this information by text while Diane was drilling him on the timeline, and felt his chest do something complicated. The particular relief of watching your child find footing in unfamiliar terrain mixed with the awareness that the footing might be temporary. That evening, Nora sat at the kitchen table with Lily and helped her trace the outline of a hand for an art project. And Cole stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the two of them bent over the paper. Nora's precise and careful movements slowing to Lily's pace, Lily chattering about Sophie and the difference between volcanoes and geysers. Nora following the conversation with the attentiveness of someone who found it genuinely interesting rather than merely tolerable. This was not performance. There was no audience for it. Cole was the only one watching, and Nora didn't know he was. He went back to the living room and sat with the contract on the coffee table and thought about the nature of things that start as one thing and become another. Tuesday morning broke cold and clear, the lake flat and silver outside the windows, the kind of autumn morning in Chicago that feels like a held breath before something releases. Cole was awake before 5. He found Nora already in the kitchen, her hands around a mug dressed in charcoal that fit her like it had been designed specifically for whatever she needed to project today, and it had been he'd come to understand. Her clothes were not decoration, they were argument. Lily wandered in 20 minutes later, rubbing her eyes, and Nora poured orange juice without being asked and made toast exactly the way Lily had eaten it the previous 3 mornings, butter only cut diagonally because Lily had informed Carmen on day 1 that triangles tasted better. Cole had overheard this and not said anything. Nora had apparently noted it and acted on it, which told him something he filed carefully. "Do you have to be at work today?" Lily settled onto a stool at the kitchen counter with her juice, watching Nora navigate the toaster with the serious attention she applied to adults doing things they seemed competent at. "Yes, sweetheart. An important meeting." Nora set the toast in front of her. "Carmen will take you to school and pick you up. And tonight we'll do something. Cookies. Chocolate chip if you want." Lily nodded with the finality of someone ratifying an agreement. Cole caught Nora's eye over Lily's head, and something passed between them that wasn't named. Walter drove them through morning traffic that seemed to have doubled overnight, as if the city had gathered for the occasion. Cole wore the navy suit Diane's instruction confident without trying, and sat in the back seat next to Nora, running through the backstory one last time in his head, not because he needed it, but because the discipline of it kept him from the alternative, which was sitting with the magnitude of what the next few hours contained. The executive floor was already populated when they arrived. Sylvia Park offered Cole a smile that carried genuine warmth. Frank Aldridge nodded, once the nod of a man reserving judgment until he had sufficient data. Owen Pratt gave Cole a thumbs up that he clearly intended to be subtle, and which was not subtle at all, and Cole appreciated it anyway. Helen Drace stood at the far end of the room with a coffee cup and an expression that gave away nothing except that she'd come prepared. And then Grant Mercer walked in. Cole had constructed an expectation from the facts available. A man who'd built something significant, who'd walked away with $50 million, who'd spent 3 years in careful preparation for this moment. The reality was smaller than the expectation in physical terms, about 5'9", with the groomed assurance of someone who understood that presentation was power. Sandy hair, expensive watch, a suit that communicated success without announcement. When he saw Cole, the smile he wore widened into something different, the smile of a man who has seen the move his opponent is about to make and believes he's already countered it. "So it's real?" His voice carried just far enough. "The janitor playing Prince." Sylvia's voice came down like a blade. "That's enough, Grant. You're here as a courtesy. Behave accordingly or find the door." Grant lifted both hands in a gesture of mock surrender, but his eyes stayed on Cole, moving across him the way an inspector moves across something presented for judgment, looking for the flaw that explains the failure. Frank Aldridge called the meeting to order at 9 sharp, and Grant's presentation began. It was devastating in the particular way of things, assembled by someone with patience and resources. He had bank records, the $50,000 transfer to an account in Cole Hargrove's name, initiated the morning after the date on the marriage license. He had security footage, time-stamped, dated, showing with unmistakable clarity the sequence of Cole arriving with Lily for his regular shift, And the first moment Nora Caldwell appeared on the same floor, the first moment unambiguous with no prior encounter visible on any camera in the building for any of the preceding 7 months. He had phone records showing no communication between Nora's devices and any number associated with Cole Hargrove before the night in question. He had Cole's HR file showing the promotion memo time-stamped 22 hours after the Cook County marriage registration. "This isn't a love story," Grant said, and his voice had settled into the register of a man making an argument he'd rehearsed until it came out sounding like discovery. "This is a crisis response. A CEO who's spent her adult life choosing work over every personal relationship, who's been told by the people around her that the balance is unsustainable, who suddenly finds herself facing legal consequences for that choice, and instead of addressing the underlying truth, she does what she's always done. She identifies a problem and she purchases a solution." He turned to Cole directly. "How much is she paying you to be here today, Mr. Hargrove? And what happens to that arrangement at the end of 6 weeks?" Diane was on her feet before the question completed itself. "Mr. Mercer, you're asking about private financial arrangements between a married couple, which is not a domain this board has standing to explore, and any characterization of those arrangements as employment compensation is speculation presented as fact, which I'll be noting for the record." Grant acknowledged this with a slight inclination of his head and continued, because he'd expected the objection and built the presentation to survive it. The board members shifted in their seats. Even Sylvia Cole noticed had lost a fraction of the warmth she'd carried into the room. The door opened. Diane Weston walked to the front of the room with the composed deliberateness of someone who had been waiting for precisely this moment, and behind her came a woman in her early 60s with gray-streaked hair and the particular authority of someone accustomed to being believed in rooms where belief was contested. "I'd like to introduce Dr. Margot Ewan," Diane said, addressing the board. Dr. Ewan is a licensed family therapist specializing in child custody assessment and family systems evaluation. She's been court-appointed in over 200 custody proceedings in this state, and her professional assessments have been entered into evidence in federal court. Last week, when I received a preliminary summary of the materials Mr. Mercer planned to present today, I contacted Dr. Ewan independently. I asked her to conduct an observational assessment of the household at Lakeshore Drive. She agreed, and she's conducted 6 sessions over the past 8 days. Cole felt the shift in the room like a barometric change. He looked at Nora, who was looking at Diane with an expression of someone absorbing a move they didn't know had been made on their behalf. They'd met with Dr. Ewan twice. Diane had framed it as a standard precaution, had asked them to treat it as a routine check-in, had not mentioned that the results might appear in a boardroom. The surprise on Nora's face was not performance. The board looking at it could see that clearly. Dr. Ewan set a folder on the table and spoke with the unhurried clarity of someone who'd testified in front of skeptical audiences many times. 6 sessions. Home observation on 3 separate evenings. Interviews with Carmen with 2 of Lily's teachers at Rosewood Academy with Lily herself in an age-appropriate conversational format. What she'd found was a family in formation, not a completed thing, but a real thing. The attachment behaviors were consistent with genuine relationship development. Lily had used the word mom, addressing Nora on 2 separate occasions in contexts where no adult was observing. Carmen had reported this without being asked. Nora had modified her work schedule, leaving the office by 6 p.m. 4 of the 6 evenings during the observation period. The adult relationship showed the markers of 2 people building communication patterns rather than performing them. Disagreements handled with specific and effortful respect, division of parental responsibility that had developed organically rather than by assignment. "My professional conclusion," Dr. Ewan said, "is that this family unit is genuine, not finished, not easy, but genuine. I've evaluated enough fabricated domestic situations and custody proceedings to recognize what they look like. This isn't that." Grant's voice arrived before the pause could solidify. "She's been hired by Nora's attorney. Her conclusions are a purchased opinion." Dr. Ewan didn't look at him. "I'm court-appointed in active cases in Cook County, DuPage County, and Lake County, Mr. Mercer. My continued appointment depends entirely on the independence of my assessments. If you'd like to discuss the professional consequences of bias in my field, I'm happy to continue, but I'd recommend against it." Sylvia Park leaned forward. "Grant, did you know about Dr. Ewan's involvement before today?" He hadn't. Cole could see it, the fractional displacement in Grant's control, the slight narrowing of something that had been calculating freely, suddenly finding a variable it hadn't accounted for. Grant regrouped with the speed of someone who'd rehearsed for contingencies. He pulled up a new document on the screen, and the room's temperature dropped before he'd said a word, because the shift in his manner communicated that whatever came next was something he'd been holding specifically for this moment. "Since we're establishing what's real," he said, "I think this board deserves to know something that Nora Caldwell has kept from everyone in this room for 8 years. Something that speaks directly to the question of judgment, specifically to the question of whether her judgment about what the rules apply to her has ever been sound." The screen displayed a date. March 15th, 2017. Claire Caldwell, Nora's younger sister. At 2:17 a.m. on that date, Claire was driving northbound on Lakeshore Drive in a vehicle registered to a rental company. She was intoxicated. She struck a pedestrian named Tyler Reeves, 19 years old, a second-year student at the University of Illinois at Chicago studying engineering, and she fled the scene without stopping. Tyler Reeves died at the scene. He had no family in the city. He was the first person in his family to attend a 4-year university. The room was completely silent. The kind of silence that doesn't come from the absence of sound, but from the presence of something everyone is simultaneously processing. Claire called her sister. Not an ambulance, not the police, her sister. Grant's voice had flattened into something that was worse than anger, the cadence of a man presenting evidence he finds conclusive. Nora Caldwell, instead of contacting law enforcement, contacted her own legal team. The Reeves family was approached within 72 hours and offered a settlement. $2.5 million in exchange for a signed agreement covering any and all civil claims arising from the incident. The criminal matter was handled through the quiet closure of an investigation that had very little cooperation from witnesses and none from the family. Claire Caldwell was never charged. She was never prosecuted. She resumed her life. Grant turned to look at the board members one by one. "This is who has been running your company. Someone who believes that money is the appropriate response to a 19-year-old boy dying in the road. Someone who thinks that what the law requires applies to other people." He paused on purpose. "And now she's manufactured a family using the same method: identify a problem, apply funds, arrange the appearance of something that isn't there." Frank Aldridge's voice arrived carefully. "Nora, do you have a response?" Nora stood. Cole stood beside her, and the movement was instinct rather than choreography, something his body decided before his mind confirmed it. Nora's voice was steady in the way things are steady when the effort of making them so is enormous and invisible. "Everything Grant has described regarding March 15, 2017 is factually accurate. I transferred money to the Reeves family. Claire was never charged. I made those decisions." Helen Drace sat back in her chair with the expression of someone whose prediction has been confirmed. His interpretation of what those decisions mean is where he's wrong. Cole was already moving. Not because Diane had scripted this. Not because the plan called for it. Because he'd listened to Grant Mercer for 40 minutes use the facts of other people's lives like currency, and there was a point at which staying seated became its own kind of statement. "Mr. Mercer," Cole's voice carried in the room without effort, "you've spent 40 minutes presenting accurate information in service of inaccurate conclusions, and I'd like to address the last part specifically." He looked at the board, not at Grant. "You told this room that Tyler Reeves was 19 years old, first in his family to attend university. You said it like it was evidence, like it was a point in your argument." Cole let a beat pass. "Tyler Reeves died 8 years ago. His family has been living with that loss for 8 years. And you just used him, his name, his age, his ambitions as a piece of evidence in a corporate board dispute. That's not concern for justice. That's grave robbing dressed up in a suit." The room had gone very still. 8 years ago, Nora got a phone call at 2 a.m. from the only family she had left in the world. Her parents were already gone. Her sister was 22 years old and terrified and had done something that couldn't be undone. Nora made a wrong decision, not a small wrong decision, a serious one with serious consequences for a family who deserved better than what they received. Cole held his ground, kept his voice even the way his father had taught him that the strength of an argument wasn't in its volume. But Grant Mercer was her partner when that happened. He was in this company in her life, positioned to know what she knew, and for 8 years he said nothing. He did nothing. He waited patiently, carefully, with everything documented for the moment when it would cause the most damage to someone he wanted to destroy. That's not justice. That's a weapon that was cleaned and loaded and held for the right opportunity. He turned to look at Grant directly. The distance between what you're presenting and what you're doing is the distance between honesty and performance, and this board is smart enough to see it. Sylvia Park's voice arrived before the silence could harden. Grant, when did you learn about the 2017 incident? The pause that followed was the most honest thing Grant Mercer had done since entering the room. It lasted 3 seconds too long. At the time, he said, I was... Yes or no, Sylvia said. At the time of the incident, did you know? Yes. Owen Pratt spoke quietly from the far end of the table. And you reported it to no one. That's not the relevant... It is, Frank Aldridge said. And when Frank Aldridge's voice carried that particular weight, rooms tended to stop moving. The statute of limitations on obstruction of justice in Illinois is 3 years. This board is not a court of law. What we're here to determine is whether Nora Caldwell is fit to lead this company, and what I'm currently determining is that you've presented a grievance you held in silence for 8 years and revealed it at a moment specifically calculated to maximize damage to someone who rejected you. That's a significant piece of context for everything else you've presented today. Frank looked around the table. I move to dismiss the petition and reaffirm Nora Caldwell as CEO of Caldwell Systems. All in favor. 10 hands rose without hesitation. Helen Drace's took 4 seconds longer, and then it rose too, 11-0. Grant collected his materials with hands that were controlled, but not entirely. On his way out, he passed close enough to Cole and Nora that his voice reached them without reaching the room. Enjoy what you've built. I know things you haven't heard yet, and when you hear them... His eyes went to Nora. We'll see whether your husband still wants to stand next to you. Then the door closed behind him, and the room exhaled. The arrest came through Diane's phone 40 minutes later, while they were still in a smaller conference room letting the adrenaline metabolize. Whitmore Associates had been thorough in the way of firms that believe results justify methods, and Grant had authorized several of their methods in writing, which was the kind of operational carelessness that happened when a man had been so certain of winning that he'd stopped thinking about losing. Breaking and entering at a former business associate's office. Theft of proprietary documents. Attempted blackmail of 2 individuals connected to Caldwell Systems board. The bail was set at $500,000. Diane put her phone down and looked at both of them. That's better than expected on balance. The board vote is done. The criminal exposure eliminates Grant's leverage on the civil side. You're through the primary crisis. She paused. But we need to discuss what he said on his way out, because that wasn't a bluff. Grant doesn't make exit statements for theatrical effect. If he says there's something else, there's something else. Nora was quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. The controlled composure had been replaced by something more fundamental. The stillness of someone who'd been waiting for a specific impact and now felt it arriving. I'll handle it, she said, which was not an answer. Lily had made an erupting baking soda volcano at Rosewood's after-school science table, according to Carmen's text, and had apparently narrated the geological process to her table mates with a level of detail that made her teacher wonder what they were feeding her at home. Cole read this standing in the elevator on the way up and felt the particular lifting sensation of good news arriving in a moment that needed it. The 3 of them made chocolate chip cookies that evening as promised, and the kitchen acquired the particular disorder of a 6-year-old who has been given creative control over the chocolate portion of the recipe. Lily poured in roughly twice the called-for quantity, which resulted in cookies that were structurally ambitious. Nora didn't redirect. She watched Lily's face as the baking sheet went into the oven, the anticipation, the investment, and she made a note of the moment the same way Cole had learned she made notes of things quietly, without announcement, storing it somewhere she'd be able to find it later. After Lily went to bed, Cole found Nora on the balcony again. The temperature had dropped. She was in a sweater rather than the armor of the boardroom. Her hair down, a glass of red wine held loosely. The lake was churned up in the dark white caps visible even from this height. "He said there's more." Cole opened because they'd been circling it since the conference room, and circling didn't move anything forward. "I know what there is." Nora held the wine without drinking. "I've been deciding how to tell you for 2 weeks. I didn't tell you before the board meeting because I needed you going in without carrying it, and I tell myself that was strategy. But part of it was that I didn't want to watch your face change." Cole said nothing. He gave her the silence, which was what she needed, and he watched the lake and waited. Claire wasn't just drunk that night. Nora's voice was level, in the way voices are level when the effort of leveling them is enormous. She was using cocaine, had been for 2 years, and I knew. I'd known for nearly a year before March 2017. She'd come to me twice asking for money, not explaining what it was for, but lying badly enough that I eventually understood. I gave her the money both times because it was easier than the conversation I needed to have, and because I kept telling myself she'd find the bottom of it herself and stop. The weight of that hung in the air between them. Tyler Reeves didn't die because my sister drove drunk. He died because my sister drove drunk and high, and I had spent a year choosing not to force the intervention that might have prevented it. Nora set her wine on the railing. "That's what Grant has. Not just the settlement, the full picture. My culpability wasn't only in the response, it was in everything that came before it." Cole processed this in the way he processed serious information carefully, giving each piece its full weight before moving to the next one. "What happened to Claire after rehab? Inpatient 30 days, then outpatient 6 months, then 2 years of therapy. She's been sober for 8 years. She teaches English at a middle school outside Boston. She's married to a man named Tom who doesn't know what happened. She calls me once a month." Nora's jaw set. "She's been quietly sending money to the Reeves family for years. From her teacher's salary. Not much, but consistent. She didn't tell me she was doing it." Cole looked at her sideways. "She didn't tell you?" "No, I found out separately." Something shifted in Nora's expression, not quite what Cole would call softened, but changed. That's the thing about guilt. It makes people do things without asking permission. The wind off the lake was cold enough now to be uncomfortable, and neither of them moved. "Grant was right that I throw money at problems," Nora said. "He was right that it's the only tool I've fully trusted for most of my adult life. It removes the problem from the immediate field of view. It creates the impression of resolution. It lets you keep moving forward, which is the only thing I've known how to do since I was 23 and had a 15-year-old to raise and a company to build and no room to stop and process anything. And it doesn't actually fix anything." "No, it doesn't." She looked at the lake. "Tyler Reeves's mother is still missing her son. The money didn't touch that. Nothing touches that." Cole turned to face her more directly. "There's something you could do. Not legally, Diane would object, but as a person." He chose his words with the care of someone who understood they might land in a place he couldn't predict. "You could try to meet her. Not to make it better because it can't be made better, but to give her something real instead of just a check. To let her look at the person who made the choices that were made and say whatever she needs to say to that person." Nora looked at him. The expression on her face was complicated enough that Cole couldn't fully read it. Part surprise, part something that might have been fear, part something that looked like the beginning of a decision. "She'd never agree to meet me." "You don't know that until you try." A long silence. The lake moved below them in the dark. Then Nora reached across the railing distance between them and took his hand. Not the practiced touch of the dinner party, not the choreographed gesture of two people constructing an appearance, but the movement of someone who needs something solid and has decided to be honest about it. Cole held her hand and didn't say anything else, because sometimes the most useful thing a person can do is stay. The final 3 weeks of the contract introduced a rhythm that none of them had anticipated. Nora began leaving the office at 5:30, which her assistant apparently found alarming enough to flag as unusual 3 times before accepting it as the new pattern. She read to Lily every night not the first book, which was Cole's by established custom, but the second, which Lily had begun reserving for her with the specific preferences of a child who knows what she wants and is learning that she's allowed to ask for it. She was learning what Lily liked in a story action over description dialogue, over narration, the kind of ending that left you feeling the world was basically fair and adjusting accordingly, which was not nothing. People who paid that kind of attention to a child's literary preferences were paying a certain kind of attention to the child. Carmen reported to Cole privately twice that Lily had said "Mom" in contexts where it seemed entirely unscripted, once asking Nora where the good scissors were kept once in her sleep apparently, which Cole found difficult to sit with and didn't know what to do with. Cole's role at Caldwell Systems had expanded in ways the contract hadn't specified. The facility's operations he'd inherited were functional but not optimized systems that had grown up organically as the company scaled, never redesigned with the whole picture in mind. He'd started quietly mapping the inefficiencies the second week, not because anyone asked him to, but because it was what he did. He walked through a space and saw what was wrong with it and figured out how to fix it. By the 4th week, he'd produced a 12-page proposal for restructuring the building management systems across Caldwell's 3 Chicago locations with projected cost savings in the range of $400,000 annually. He'd handed it to the VP of Operations without mentioning it to Nora. The VP of Operations mentioned it to Nora. Nora read it in the car on the way home and was quiet for the duration of the ride in a way that was different from her usual quiet something working behind it. "You did this without being asked," she said when they reached the apartment. "It needed doing. Most people who are handed a title and a salary and told the job is temporary don't invest the energy to do things that needed doing." Cole considered this. "My dad spent 40 years doing a job he was supposed to do in a way he knew was right regardless of who was watching. That's not virtue. That's just how you don't lose yourself." Nora looked at him for a moment with an expression he was beginning to learn the look of someone adding a fact to a growing file. "The board wants to meet with you separately. Sylvia specifically. She has questions about your proposal." "That's fine. It's more than fine." She put her keys down on the hall table. "It's Cole. This is a significant document. The analysis is sound." "I know." He wasn't being arrogant. He was being accurate, which was a distinction his father had also taught him. She almost laughed. He hadn't heard her come close to laughing before, and the sound of it startled genuine short-changed something in the temperature of the hallway. Then came the Wednesday of the 4th week, and everything that had been building underneath the surface came through. Cole's shift at the secondary Caldwell building in the West Loop had run long due to a cooling system issue that required his direct supervision. He'd been dealing with contracted HVAC vendors since 7 a.m. and hadn't gotten clear until 6:30 p.m. He texted Nora at 5 to let her know he'd be late. She read it. He could see the red receipt. She didn't respond. He arrived home at 6:45 to find the kitchen lights on and Carmen seated at the counter with Lily, both of them working through a chapter book. Nora's side of the closet was unopened. Her keys weren't on the hall table. Lily looked up when Cole came in. She showed him the page she was on. She didn't ask about Nora. He made dinner. They ate. He read the first book at bedtime and started the second, and Lily fell asleep halfway through in the way she sometimes did when she was tired enough. He sat in the chair beside her bed for a few minutes in the dark, listening to her breathe. 9 o'clock, Nora's phone rang through to voicemail. 10 o'clock, an automated email reply from her work account stated she was in a meeting and would respond when available. 11 o'clock, a text arrived. "Sorry, something came up." Be home soon." She came through the door at 11:42. Cole was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He wasn't positioned to confront, he was positioned to be seen, which was different. He'd left the light on over the table specifically so that she'd have to make a decision about whether to acknowledge him or take the hallway to the bedroom. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. Cole didn't raise his voice. He'd learned from watching men who raised their voices that it usually accomplished nothing except making the person on the other side defensive, which closed doors rather than opening them. He picked up the drawing Lily had brought home from school that afternoon. 3 figures and something large and winged and evidently significant with the legend, "My Family," written underneath in the careful print of a first grader who was still proud of her letters. He set it on the table where Nora could see it. "This isn't about me," Cole said, keeping his voice at the register of fact rather than accusation. "You can treat me however you want to treat me, that's part of what I agreed to. But that little girl has already watched one adult disappear on her without enough warning to prepare for it. She's smart enough not to say anything that might make it worse, which means she's learned that skill somewhere she shouldn't have had to learn it." He met Nora's eyes. "If you can't be here consistently, tell me that honestly now, before she believes in this more than it can hold." The kitchen was very quiet. Nora crossed to the table and sat down across from him. She was still in her work clothes, which meant she'd come from the office, which meant the meeting was real. But her face carried something beyond the exhaustion of a long day, the particular hollowness of someone who's been running from something and has been doing it long enough that the running is unconscious. "The meeting was real," she said. "A partnership negotiation that's been in process for 6 weeks and couldn't be rescheduled. I should have told you the timeline was uncertain this morning. I didn't because I thought I'd be done by 7. She looked at the drawing. "And because part of me was relieved to have a reason to stay later than I should have." Cole waited. "Every time something with you and Lily feels real, every time I stop translating and start just being present, I feel it like a warning signal, like something's about to go wrong because good things have historically been followed by their removal." She touched the edge of the drawing without picking it up. "That's not an excuse. It's an explanation, and I know the difference. Learning is different from practicing on a 6-year-old. The words landed where he intended them to land, and he watched her absorb them without flinching, which told him something about the kind of person she was under the control and the strategy and the armor. "I know," she said. "Then tomorrow you tell me in the morning if the day is uncertain. Not a text at 5, a conversation before we leave the table." She nodded. And then, after a pause that contained something he couldn't entirely read, "I'm going to call Diane Reeves." Cole looked at her. "You were right." Her voice had lost its professional register entirely. It was simply a person speaking. "I've been running from that for 8 years along with everything else. And running from it hasn't made it smaller. It's just made it something I carry." She pushed the drawing back toward him. "She deserves more than a check. She deserves a person who can look her in the eye." Cole didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside, the city moved in its endless way, indifferent and continuous. Inside, 2 people were sitting at a kitchen table in the late hours, with the particular clarity that arrives when the performance stops, and what's left is just the actual situation. "All right," he said. She looked at him across the table, and the expression on her face, tired and uncertain, and something he still didn't have a clean word for, was the most honest thing he'd seen from her since the first night when her hands had not been entirely still. He got up and poured the cold coffee down the sink and made fresh, and she stayed at the table, and they talked until well past midnight about things that had nothing to do with the contract. Diane Weston made the call on a Thursday morning, and the woman on the other end of the line agreed to a meeting with no hesitation, which Nora had not expected. She'd prepared for resistance, for anger delivered through a third party, for the kind of refusal that arrives wrapped in the language of legal counsel. What she got instead was a quiet voice that said yes, and named a time, and asked only that no attorneys be present at the table. Nora relayed this to Cole that evening with the expression of someone who'd been braced for a door to hold and found it open, which was its own kind of disorientation. "She said yes immediately?" he asked. She said she'd been waiting for it. Nora was standing at the kitchen counter, not quite still. Not for me specifically. She said she'd been waiting to have a conversation with someone connected to what happened. That the money gave her family financial stability, but it didn't give her anywhere to put the rest of it. Cole understood what that meant in the way he understood most things about loss from proximity rather than theory from watching his father work through grief the way you work through a long physical job methodically without shortcuts, without any illusion that the work would be quick. Somewhere to put the rest of it. That was accurate. The restaurant was a small place in Pilsen, the kind of neighborhood establishment that had outlasted several waves of the city changing around it, corner location, a hand-lettered sign, tables with mismatched chairs that had been there long enough to feel like choices rather than accidents. Diane Weston drove them and remained in the car, which was the agreement, though she'd extracted a commitment to check-in texts at 30-minute intervals that Cole suspected had less to do with legal caution than with the fact that she'd come to feel responsible for the people she was supposed to only represent. Diane Reeves was already seated when they arrived. Cole had formed an image from the facts available, a woman in her 50s defined by loss, defined by the specific weight of raising children after the largest one was taken, and the person at the corner table both matched and exceeded that image. She was 54, wearing a dark dress and a small silver cross, her hands around a water glass. Her face was the face of someone who had decided through what must have been sustained and difficult effort that grief was not going to be the last word on her character. She looked at Nora when they approached, and what she looked with was not the hostility Cole had been quietly preparing for. It was something more demanding than hostility. It was attention. Nora slid into the seat across from her. Cole sat beside Nora. The table between them was small enough that distance wasn't an option. For a moment nobody said anything, and Cole had the sense of being present at something that needed to find its own beginning rather than being handed one. Diane Reeves spoke first. "You paid us to be quiet about Tyler." Nora's voice came out steady. "Yes. I hated you for 8 years because of it. I want you to know that because I think the truth matters more than being polite to you. You're right to have hated me. The decision was wrong." Diane Reeves studied her. The quality of her attention was the kind that doesn't miss anything, the attention of someone who has spent years making assessments that mattered. "Why are you here now? The statute ran out years ago. You're not in legal danger from me." "I know." Nora's hands were on the table. Not quite still, Cole noticed, and remembered the first night, and understood that the stillness she'd built over years was not the same as peace. "My husband told me there's a difference between running from something and having it behind you. I've been running for 8 years. I wanted to stop." Diane Reeves looked at Cole for the first time. The look was brief, but complete. Then she looked back at Nora. "Your sister has been writing to me. Every March. 15 letters so far." Nora's expression shifted a fractional movement that would have been invisible if Cole hadn't learned to look for it. "I didn't know that." "She didn't tell you?" "No." Something moved through Diane Reeves's face. "She sends money too, every year. Not much. She said in the first letter that it was teacher money, not your money, and that she needed me to know the difference. She said she was sending it for my younger boys' educations because that's what Tyler was working toward when he died." She paused. "I didn't write back for 7 years. Last year I did. I told her I'd read every letter." Nora was very still in a way that was different from her professional stillness, the stillness of someone receiving information that rearranges things she thought she understood. Cole watched it happen and thought about Claire in Boston writing letters every March to a woman who hadn't responded for 7 years, and writing them anyway because the alternative was the silence she'd earned, and silence apparently wasn't something she was willing to accept as permanent. Diane Reeves reached into her bag and produced a photograph. She set it on the table and turned it so it faced Nora. Tyler Reeves at 19. His mother's eyes a laugh that had been caught mid-arrival. A young man who had not yet reached the thing he was moving toward. Cole looked at the photograph and felt the specific weight of looking at someone who had existed fully and then stopped. He wanted to design bridges, Diane Reeves said. He talked about the Chicago River infrastructure, how the city had all these old systems that were going to need rebuilding. He had a specific idea about it. She didn't say anything else about the idea, and Cole understood that some things are kept because letting them go would mean something. Nora's jaw was tight. "Mrs. Reeves, I can't undo what happened. I can't give you what was taken. Anything I say about what I should have done differently is 8 years late and doesn't touch the actual damage." She held the older woman's gaze. "I set up a scholarship at UIC in Tyler's name, for first-generation engineering students. I should have done it years ago. I kept not doing it because doing it meant standing in front of the fact of what I was doing it for, and I wasn't ready to stand there." A pause. "I'm telling you now because I wanted you to hear it from me directly, not through a press release." Diane Reeves was quiet for a long moment. The restaurant moved around them, a server taking an order at the next table. The sound of the kitchen. Someone near the window laughing at something. Life in its persistent, indifferent continuance. "I'm Catholic," Diane Reeves said finally. "I believe in forgiveness the way I believe in breathing, not because it's easy, because you'll die without it." She reached across the table and placed her hand over Nora's. Her hand was warm and completely steady. "I'm not forgiving what happened to Tyler. What happened to Tyler doesn't belong to me to forgive, it belongs to him, and he's not here to grant it. What I'm telling you is that I'm not going to carry you as my enemy anymore. You're not worth the weight of that." She let her hand rest there for a moment. "What you're worth is doing better. Both of you." She looked at Cole again. "Don't let her turn this into a debt she pays off. Let her turn it into something she builds." Cole met her eyes and nodded, once the nod of a man making a commitment he intends to keep. Diane Reeves picked up the photograph, looked at her son for a moment, and returned it to her bag with the care of someone returning something precious to its proper place. "The scholarship. Make sure it goes to kids who have the idea but not the runway. Tyler had the idea. He just needed more runway." "I will," Nora said. They stayed another 20 minutes talking about Tyler's brothers. Both of them still in school, the middle one showing an aptitude for mathematics that their mother described with the particular pride of a woman who has learned to find abundance in what remains. When they stood to leave, Diane Reeves embraced Nora briefly with the brisk sincerity of someone who doesn't perform gestures. She shook Cole's hand. Outside, the Pilsen street was ordinary and alive, a November afternoon with the smell of winter making its intention known. Cole and Nora stood on the sidewalk, and Nora didn't speak for a long time. Cole let the silence be. Then she put her face in her hands and cried, not the careful, managed expression of distress that a person in her position has usually learned to produce when necessary, but the full and ungoverned release of someone who has been holding something at arm's length for 8 years and has finally, in the presence of the one person with the most right to demand more than she received, been allowed to put it down. Cole put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and the sidewalk held them both, and the city moved past without comment. After a while she straightened and wiped her face with the back of her hand and said with the precise articulation of someone making a statement, "They intend to be held to, I want to meet with the UIC engineering dean next week. I want to make sure the scholarship parameters are right. I want it to be for students who have the idea and need the runway." Cole said, "Okay. And I want Claire to know I know about the letters." Nora looked at him. "I've been letting her carry that alone because I didn't want to have the conversation. That's cowardice dressed up as consideration." "Yes," Cole said, because she wasn't asking him to soften it. She almost smiled at that. "You do that more than most people." "What?" "Agree with me when I'm being hard on myself. Most people rush to argue you out of it. Most people argue you out of it because it makes them uncomfortable. What you said was accurate." He looked at her. "You're also not only what you did wrong. That's equally true, and you don't need me to tell you, but I'm telling you anyway." She looked at him for a moment in the afternoon light, and then she looked away at the street, and he could see her putting the pieces of something back together in a configuration that had room for more than the weight she'd been carrying. The final week of the contract arrived without announcement. the way the last week of anything arrives suddenly apparent once you're already in it. Diane Weston had messaged Friday morning to confirm the timeline and to flag that she'd be bringing the relevant documents Saturday evening: annulment papers, a contract extension option, property settlement paperwork covering the terms of separation if the arrangement concluded as originally specified. Cole told Nora at breakfast, and she said she'd be home early, and she was 4:30 still in her work clothes, but with the deliberate quality of someone who'd cut the day short on purpose. She helped Lily finish a poster project for school lying on the living room floor with colored markers, and Cole sat at the kitchen table listening to the two of them debate whether a diagram of the water cycle needed a sun or whether the sun was implied. "The sun is never implied," Lily said with conviction. "You always have to show the sun." "That's a reasonable position," Nora said. "It's the correct position." Lily selected the yellow marker. "Carmen says details matter. The sun is a detail." Cole looked at the two of them on the floor and thought about the night in Logan Square when he'd packed their lives into 3 suitcases and the particular sadness of how quickly it had gone. He thought about what Lily had said this morning while he was making her lunch. Not to him, apparently to her rabbit, in the low voice she used for private communications. "I hope we don't move again." He'd stood at the counter and held very still and not said anything. Diane arrived at 7:15 after Lily was in bed with a leather portfolio and the manner of someone who'd learned over a career to present difficult paperwork without editorializing. She set the documents on the coffee table in organized sequence. Annulment petition, extension agreement with modified terms, property settlement, a cover sheet summarizing Cole's financial entitlements under the original contract which had been fully earned. "The financial disbursements are already processed," Diane said. "The final payment cleared this morning. Rosewood's next semester tuition is prepaid. Cole's salary and title transfer remain as specified regardless of which of these you sign." She looked at both of them. "I'll need a decision before I leave tonight or instructions to return Monday." Nora said she'd like a few minutes, and Diane nodded and went to the kitchen to make coffee she probably didn't need because she was perceptive enough to understand that her presence in the room was a form of pressure. Cole and Nora sat with the documents between them on the coffee table, and the apartment was quiet in the way it was quiet after Lily went to sleep, a specific kind of quiet occupied by the presence of someone nearby who wasn't yet aware of the weight of what the adults in her vicinity were deciding. Nora looked at the papers and then at her hands and then at Cole, and she said, "What do you want?" Cole had been thinking about the answer to that question since the night at the kitchen table when she'd stayed past midnight talking about things that had nothing to do with strategy. He'd been thinking about it since the afternoon he'd stood in the doorway and watched her on the living room floor showing Lily the right way to draw water, evaporating, and Lily had leaned against her side without any apparent awareness that this was something she'd chosen to do. He'd been thinking about it since the balcony, since the sidewalk in Pilsen, since every small, ordinary moment that had accumulated without his noticing into something that now felt so essential it was hard to remember the shape of things before it. "I think you should go first," he said. She shook her head. "I asked you first, deliberately, because every time the question has come up before I've answered it, and then waited to see whether you'd say something that matched. That's not fair to either of us." She held his gaze with the directness she brought to everything that mattered. "I want to know what you actually want, not what you think you should want, not what makes sense given how this started, what you want." Cole considered the documents. He thought about the annulment petition, the clean exit, the money already cleared, the title secure, the possibility of walking away from this apartment and this situation with everything the contract promised and nothing complicated attached. He thought about what that walk would look like. He thought about Lily asking the rabbit whether they were going to move again. He thought about what he'd said to Nora the night of the dinner party, that he'd spent most of his adult life doing what he had to do rather than what he wanted, and that maybe it was time to want something. He'd been performing when he said it, or at least he'd thought he was. He wasn't sure anymore where the performance had ended. "I want to stay," he said. Not because of the money you can consider the financial terms fulfilled and concluded, not because I'm trapped or because walking away would be embarrassing or because the contract makes it complicated. I want to stay because I stopped pretending somewhere around the second week, and the third week happened anyway, and the fourth week happened anyway, and somewhere in there this became the life I actually have, and I don't want a different one. Nora absorbed this without moving. Then quietly, "You stopped pretending in the second week. Around day 9, I think." "I stopped around day 11. Her mouth did something that was close to the almost laugh he'd heard in the hallway. "I was convinced it was pathological, that I was experiencing some form of attachment by proximity and would be embarrassed by it once the situation resolved. And now I think proximity is how most genuine things start, and people just don't usually admit it." She looked at the documents. "I want you to stay, Cole. I want Lily to have the room with the yellow walls without the qualifier that it's only for a while. I want to stop calculating 6 weeks out and start thinking about what happens next year and the year after." She paused. "I want to do it honestly, not based on what we built on top of a lie, but based on what we actually are, which is two people who found each other through a terrible idea and chose to take it seriously anyway." Cole picked up the annulment papers and tore them in half. The sound was clean and final, and Nora watched it happen with the expression of someone watching a door close on something they were ready to leave behind. He set the torn pages aside. "We started with a lie," he said. "Everything since then has been real. That ratio seems workable." She laughed a real laugh, not startled this time but full, arriving from somewhere that had been closed for a long time and was apparently now open. Cole had not heard that laugh before, and understood hearing it that it was something she didn't give away easily, and hadn't until now. Lily appeared in the hallway. She was in her pajamas with her rabbit, her hair pressed sideways from the pillow, operating on the internal alert system that children develop when significant things are happening nearby, even in their sleep. She looked at Cole, then at Nora, then at the torn papers on the coffee table. "Why did you rip that?" "We decided we didn't need it," Nora said. Her voice had changed, not just in the way it changed when she was talking to Lily, which Cole had come to know well, but in some additional way, looser something in the register of a person who has recently put something heavy down and is still getting used to having her hands free. Lily came into the room and looked at both of them with the thorough assessment of a 6-year-old running serious calculations. "Are we staying here forever now?" "If you want to," Cole said. "I want to." She crossed to the couch and climbed up between them, settling herself in the space with the certainty of something finding its proper location. She put her rabbit in her lap and looked at Nora. "Does that mean you're really my mom? Not just pretend?" Nora's breath caught. Cole heard it, felt the slight shift beside him. Then Nora said, with the steadiness of someone making a statement she intends to keep and knows the cost of, "if you want me to be." "I decided already," Lily said. "I decided like 2 weeks ago. I was waiting to see if you were going to leave." She leaned against Nora's arm. "You didn't leave." Nora put her arm around Lily and looked over her head at Cole, and her expression held everything that had accumulated over 6 weeks of impossible proximity and careful attention and chosen honesty, the gratitude and the fear and the specific wonder of someone who has unexpectedly been given something they'd stopped believing was available to them. Diane appeared in the kitchen doorway, took in the tableau with the quick assessment of someone who'd managed enough human situations to recognize a concluded one, and said she'd let herself out and send the paperwork in the morning. The door closed behind her with the quiet precision of a woman who understood exactly how much noise the moment required, which was none. 6 months later, Caldwell Systems had its strongest revenue quarter in company history, a fact that the financial press attributed to strategic clarity and that Sylvia Park attributed in a private conversation with Cole at a company function to a CEO who had stopped treating her own well-being as a resource to be depleted in service of the work and had started treating it as a condition for the work being done well. Cole's facilities proposal had by then been implemented across all 3 Chicago locations, and the projected savings had come in 11% above estimate, which his VP of Operations described in a memo as the result of practical genius, a phrase Cole found excessive and filed away to tell his father in whatever form of conversation he continued to have with his father, which was the internal kind conducted on early mornings when the city was quiet. Alicia called from Denver in late April to say that the new schedule was working and that Richard had been offered a permanent position and they weren't coming back, and that she wanted summers to be longer. Cole agreed to longer summers because the custody modification had already given him what he needed, and because Lily, who was informed of the arrangement afterward, said she was glad because she liked summers and she liked Denver, and she liked having 2 places that were hers, even if they were different. Cole was not sure whether his daughter was exceptionally well-adjusted or exceptionally good at locating the available comfort in difficult situations. He suspected both, and that the second one was its own form of the first. Claire came from Boston in May with her husband Tom, who turned out to be a man of few words and considered opinions, who had spent 12 years in residential construction before becoming a building inspector, and who spent most of Saturday morning with Cole on the balcony, discussing the structural challenges of Chicago's older building stock with the focused pleasure of 2 people discovering unexpected common ground. Claire was quieter than Cole had anticipated. He'd built an expectation from the weight of what she carried, and found someone who had, through sustained and evidently difficult work, learned to carry it without letting it define her gait. She taught middle school English. She'd brought copies of 2 books she used in her 8th grade class, both of which Lily appropriated on arrival, and was halfway through by Sunday morning. After dinner that Saturday, while Tom and Cole were washing up and Lily was already deep into the 2nd book, Claire stood with Nora on the balcony in the dark. Cole couldn't hear what they said. He could see through the glass the shape of a conversation between 2 people who had lived around a shared damage for a long time and were apparently finally willing to stand directly in front of it. At one point, Claire put her hand on Nora's arm and kept it there. At another point, Nora laughed at something, and it was the real laugh, the one that had come loose the night the papers were torn, and Cole turned back to the dishes and gave them the privacy of not being watched. At breakfast Sunday morning, Claire told Lily that her school district had a summer bridge program for rising 2nd graders who were reading above grade level, and that if Lily ever wanted to visit Boston for 2 weeks in July, she'd have a standing invitation. Lily said she'd check her calendar, which she said with a straight face until she couldn't, and the table broke apart, laughing. The Tyler Reeves Scholarship, launched in September, announced at a Caldwell Systems all-hands meeting that Nora opened by saying, "My husband taught me that the people who keep our buildings running deserve the same access to opportunity as the people writing the code on the floors above them. And this scholarship is a specific attempt to act on that belief rather than simply hold it." The language of the announcement attributed the inspiration to Cole directly, which he had asked her not to do, and which she had done anyway, because she'd decided, she told him afterward, with the expression of someone who knows they're going to win the argument, that credit correctly placed was not the same thing as embarrassment. Jerome, who had worked the night shift on Caldwell's facilities crew for 15 years and whose daughter was a junior in high school with grades that had consistently outrun her options, came to find Cole 2 days after the announcement. He was a man in his early 50s who had spent decades doing the invisible work of large buildings and who carried himself with the specific dignity of someone who'd decided long ago not to need external confirmation of his worth. He found Cole in the 3rd-floor utility corridor reviewing a ventilation repair, and he shook Cole's hand and couldn't speak for a moment, and then he said, "My daughter can go anywhere in the state now. That's because of you." Cole said it was because of Nora, and Jerome said it was because of both of them, and Cole accepted this because arguing the point would have been its own kind of dismissal. He took the long way back to his office after that, through the building's maintenance level, past the storage rooms and the equipment bays and the supply closets that smelled of industrial cleaner and floor buffer wax, and he thought about his father and the welding shop in Cicero and the specific pride of a man who does his work correctly regardless of who's watching. He thought about what it meant that the son of that man was now the person who'd helped make a scholarship happen for someone else's daughter. He thought it would have mattered to his father, and that it mattered to him, and that those two things being the same was not nothing. The first real argument happened in October, which Cole took as a sign that they'd arrived somewhere that had room for difficulty. Nora received an offer from a technology company based in San Francisco, a CEO position larger than Caldwell by revenue and headcount, a significant increase in compensation and profile. She told Cole about it on a Tuesday evening while Lily was at a playdate with Sophie, which meant either she'd planned it that way or the timing was coincidental, and Cole knew her well enough by then to know she'd planned it. He listened to the full picture before he said anything. The company, the scope, the terms. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" 5 years ago, I would have said yes without calling anyone. She was standing at the kitchen counter, which was where she stood when she was working something through. I would have considered the refusal of an opportunity like this a form of failure, proof that I'd stopped competing. And now I know that I built something here that I actually care about losing. She looked at him directly. Not just you and Lily. The company. The board I've rebuilt. The scholarship. The work that started from the facilities proposal that you wrote without being asked. She paused. San Francisco is a better opportunity by every metric I use to measure with, but I've changed some of the metrics. That's a good sign, Cole said. It's also terrifying. Because if I turn this down and something goes wrong here, I'll always wonder. That's true of every decision where you choose what you have over something you don't have yet. Cole looked at her. But the wondering only goes in one direction. You'd also wonder in San Francisco about what you walked away from here. The difference is what you'd be missing in each scenario, and only you know which list is longer. She turned the offer down at the end of the week. The board responded by structuring a compensation adjustment and an equity increase that Sylvia Park described to Cole privately as the most efficient retention package she'd ever seen assembled because it was constructed by people who knew what they were keeping and why. November brought the first real snow of the season, the kind that arrives overnight and in the morning has turned the familiar city into something provisional and clean. Cole was up before 6, standing at the north windows with coffee, watching the lake disappear into white. He heard Lily wake at 6:30, the specific sequence of sounds that meant she was up bare feet on hardwood, the creak of the third board in the hallway, the bathroom door. Then her footsteps coming toward the living room. She appeared beside him in her pajamas, her rabbit hanging from one hand, and pressed her palm flat against the cold glass. It snowed. It did. Can we go out in it before school? If you eat breakfast first. She was already turning for the kitchen. Cole heard her voice preceding her. Nora, it snowed. Dad says we can go outside if I eat breakfast. Do we have the good cereal? He heard Nora's response from the bedroom. Something indistinct followed by the sound of her getting up, followed by Lily's narration of the snow situation to someone who was apparently going to need a full briefing before being considered adequately informed. Cole stood at the window and let the morning be what it was. He thought about the night he'd stood in a different building, looking at a different view of this same city, and agreed to something he didn't fully understand. He thought about the quality of that agreement, the desperation in it, the calculation, the fact that what he'd said yes to bore almost no resemblance to what he'd gotten. He thought about his father, who'd spent 40 years doing a job in a way that was right, and who had also told him once near the end that the best things in a man's life are almost never the things he planned for. That planning was mostly how you got somewhere in the vicinity of where the real things happened. Nora appeared beside him with her own coffee, her hair loose, wearing the kind of morning-at-home clothes she'd started owning once she'd stopped treating every hour as a working hour. She looked at the snow and then at him. She wants to build something in the park. She'll need boots. Carmen bought her boots in October, apparently in anticipation. Carmen anticipates everything. It's her most valuable quality. Nora looked at the lake, or where the lake had been before the snow had erased the line between water and sky. Grant's bail hearing is today. Diane says the charges are solid. I know. I keep waiting to feel something about it other than tired. Tired is a feeling, Cole said. It means you've been carrying something that had weight." She considered this. Then she put her head briefly against his shoulder in the way she'd developed, not a gesture that required response, just a way of making contact, of locating herself relative to him in the space they occupied together. He put his arm around her, and they stood there while Chicago went white outside, and Lily's voice moved through the apartment asking various questions about the adequacy of her snowsuit. "She's going to want a dog again today," Nora said. "The snow always makes her want a dog. She's been building a case. It's a compelling case. I know, I've been following it." Cole looked at the snow. "She's going to get the dog." "I know." Nora lifted her coffee. "I've already done research on breeds that work well in apartments." He looked at her. She was looking at the snow with the expression of someone who has gone to significant lengths to not appear to have gone to significant lengths. "When did you do research on breeds?" 3 weeks ago. Lily's been making the argument for 5 weeks. I started listening at week 2. She glanced at him with the look that had replaced the professional mask in their private hours, not warm exactly, because warmth implied softness, and she was not soft, but something that had learned to be at ease with what it was. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of agreeing too quickly. She needs to learn that good arguments take time. Cole thought about what it must cost her, this woman who had built a significant portion of her identity around being ahead of every situation, to admit that a 6-year-old had moved her at week 2 while she'd been staging the appearance of being unmoved until week 5. He thought it cost her less than it once would have. He thought the cost was going down. "She inherited that from you," Nora said. "The patience. The persuasion. She doesn't make an argument once and repeat it louder. She makes it differently every time, looking for the angle that lands." A pause. "She's going to be formidable." "She already is." Lily appeared in the doorway in her full snow outfit, which she had assembled herself with the systematic thoroughness of someone who'd thought about this in advance. Boots, snow pants, jacket, hat, the rabbit apparently included in the winter logistics, and now wearing a small knitted scarf that Cole didn't recognize and suspected had been Carmen's contribution. "I'm ready," Lily announced. "The park's going to be really good right now because we'd be the first ones." Cole set down his coffee. "Let me get my jacket." "Nora, too," Lily said. "It's a family thing." Nora set down her coffee. Outside, the park was exactly as Lily had predicted, undisturbed white, the footprints they made the first record of anyone having moved through it that morning. Lily ran ahead and then doubled back and then ran ahead again in the pattern of someone trying to be in as many places as possible within a limited time, her boots making clean holes in the snow, the rabbit tucked into her jacket pocket with one ear visible. Cole and Nora walked behind her, close enough to intercept if the terrain required it, far enough to give her the feeling of being ahead. The lake was somewhere in the white distance present without being visible. The city moved in its muffled winter way around the edges of the park. Lily stopped in the middle of the open field and held out both arms and turned in a slow circle, looking up at the sky where the snow was still falling in unhurried flakes. Then she stopped turning and looked back at the two of them, her face lit with the particular joy of a child who is exactly where she wants to be and knows it. "This is the best day," she said with the certainty of someone making an official determination. Cole looked at Nora. Nora looked at him. Something passed between them that didn't need language, the recognition of a moment, the shared awareness of what had been survived and what had been built and what was still uncertain, and why the uncertainty no longer felt like a threat. There had been a contract once with terms and a timeline and a specific endpoint. The contract had expired. What it had built was still standing, messy and imperfect and honest in the way that things become honest when the performance stops and the people involved have to decide who they actually are to each other. Two people who'd started as instruments of each other's survival had chosen when the obligation ended to remain. That choice, made past the edge of the incentive that had produced it, made freely in full knowledge of the cost, was the thing the contract could never have guaranteed and could only have set the conditions for. Lily ran back toward them, and grabbed a hand each and pulled in the direction of a section of the park where the snow had drifted up against a low hedge. "That's a good spot," she said. "We can build something there." They went where she led, and behind them the snow was already beginning to fill in the footprints they'd made, and the city held them in its enormous, indifferent embrace, and the morning continued.